The transplant coordinator ran my HLA panel twice. I watched her do it, watched her look at the first result on her screen, go very still, and then quietly step out of the room to get the doctor. That's when I knew something was wrong. When you're just a donor candidate and they're not done with you yet, they don't go get the doctor. They schedule a follow-up. They don't come back with 2 of them. I was sitting in that hospital because my daughter was dying, and I had come to try to save her, and I could see before either of those doctors said a single word to me that something in those results was going to complicate everything. What I didn't know yet was that those results weren't going to complicate my life. They were going to end the story my ex-wife had spent 3 years building, the story she'd told my daughter about who I was and why I'd disappeared. All it took was a blood draw, a room that went quiet, and 5 words I said so softly the doctor had to lean in to hear them. I need to be honest with you from the start about what kind of story this is, because the way I'm telling it probably makes it sound like a revenge story. It isn't. I didn't walk into that hospital to expose anyone or burn anything down. I walked in because a 16-year-old girl who had called me dad since before she could talk needed a kidney, and I had 2. What happened afterward happened because the truth, once it has a reason to come out in a room full of medical professionals, doesn't stay quiet. And if you've ever loved a child who was taken from you and kept loving them anyway, with nothing asked in return, stay with me. This is for you. Okay, let me back up. My name is Travis, and I own a small electrical contracting company in Columbus, Ohio. Me and 3 other guys, we wire new construction, rewire old houses, do commercial jobs when we can get them. It's not glamorous, it's honest work, and I've been doing it since I was 22, and I've never been ashamed of a single day of it. I make a decent living, not the kind of decent where the bills get paid and the fridge stays full, and for a long time there was enough left over for a daughter's soccer cleats and a family trip to the Outer Banks every summer. I met Diane 16 years ago at a job site. She wasn't a client, she was the sister of a client, stopped by to drop something off, and we ended up talking in the driveway for 40 minutes in the August heat. She was funny in a way that caught me off guard, the kind of funny where you laugh before you even know why. I asked for her number before she got back in her car. On our 3rd date, she told me she was pregnant. 14 weeks along. The father, a guy she'd been with for 2 years, a man named Scott who had packed a bag and driven to Phoenix the week after she showed him the positive test and never looked back, was gone. She was 31 years old, alone, and holding herself together in front of me with a visible effort that I found more impressive than anything else about her. I could see the seams. I want to be exact about what I knew and when, because it's the hinge of everything that follows. I knew that afternoon exactly whose child she was carrying. She told me plainly because she was not someone who kept things like that to herself, and I believed her completely. There was no confusion, no ambiguity I was quietly pushing down. She told me and I heard her and I understood. And here is what I told her, sitting across a table at a diner in Hilliard, Ohio, with decaf coffee because she wasn't supposed to have regular anymore. I told her it didn't matter. Not the way people say things don't matter when they actually do. I mean, it genuinely did not change anything for me. I looked at this woman carrying a baby by herself because the man who should have been there had run, and I didn't feel hesitation. I felt something closer to clarity, the kind of deciding that doesn't announce itself. It just happens and then it's done. We got married 7 months later. Diane was 6 weeks from her due date, and she moved a little slower than she liked, and she looked more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen, and 4 weeks after that my daughter was born, Maya Rose. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and the loudest thing I had ever heard. I was in the delivery room. I held her before almost anyone else did. I counted her fingers. I watched her face go from furious to curious to asleep in about 20 minutes, and I was gone. That was it. Whatever I had been before that moment rearranged itself permanently around that small, squinting face. And I need you to understand this clearly, because it's the part that matters most and the part my ex-wife spent 3 years trying to erase. I never once, not one time in 16 years, thought of Maya as anything other than my daughter. Biology is a set of facts. Fatherhood is a set of choices made every morning, and I made those choices with everything I had. I made them when I built her a toddler bed with rails so she wouldn't roll out. I made them when I stayed up until 2 in the morning before her 3rd grade science fair because the model volcano wasn't working right and I refused to let it beat us. I made them when she was 9 and a girl at school told her she had ugly hair, and I sat on the edge of her bed for an hour telling her what was actually true, which was that she had the best hair I'd ever seen and that girl could take a hike. I coached her recreational soccer team from age 6 through age 12. I drove her to every tournament in 4 years across 3 states. I learned more about youth soccer than any electrician in Columbus has any business knowing. I was the one who got called when she had appendicitis in 7th grade, who sat in the surgery waiting room for 4 hours with cold coffee going warm in my hands, who was there when she woke up disoriented and scared and grabbed for my hand. I was there, all of it, not because I had to be, because she was mine. There's one memory I come back to more than any other. Maya was 3, maybe 3.5. We had a Saturday morning pancake tradition, and she had gotten up early one morning and come downstairs before Diane was awake and climbed up on the counter stool and looked at me very seriously and said, "Daddy, can we put blueberries in the pancakes today?" And the way she said Daddy, not asking for anything complicated, just saying the word the way you say a word you're completely sure of, I had to turn back to the stove for a second so she didn't see my face. She was mine. She had been mine since the delivery room. That Saturday morning with the blueberries was just the moment I understood it all the way down. Diane and I were good for a long time. Not a perfect marriage, but a real one. Arguments about money and in-laws and whose turn it was to call the plumber, and underneath all of that, a family that held together. I thought we'd be the couple that argues about small things for 50 years and loves each other anyway. I thought I'd dance with Maya at her wedding. But in the last couple of years, Diane changed. I've spent a long time trying to fully understand, and I've decided to stop, because there isn't a clean answer. She started a new job, corporate HR, nicer part of the city, different kind of people. And she started looking at our life the way you look at a house that's not quite big enough anymore. Like it wasn't bad, just smaller than it used to feel. She asked for a divorce on a Tuesday in March. I remember it because there was freezing rain and I'd come home early from a job and she was already sitting at the kitchen table, like she'd been waiting, and she didn't wait for me to take off my jacket. I was heartbroken, but I heard her. People fall out of love. I don't think that makes someone bad. I told her we'd do it right, divide things fairly, figure out a sharing arrangement with Maya that made sense, stay a family in the ways that still mattered. That is not what happened. Because Diane didn't just want a divorce. She wanted a clean exit, and she knew one thing about me, one thing she had known for 13 years and never used, and she made the decision to use it. She knew I would never voluntarily tell Maya the truth about her biological father, not because I was ashamed of anything, but because I knew what that information could do to a 13-year-old girl who had never had a reason to question the ground under her. I had spent 13 years making sure my daughter felt completely and unconditionally wanted. I was not going to let a custody hearing take that from her. Diane understood that. She understood it better than anyone, and she picked it up and used it like a lever. She went for full custody, and when my attorney started talking about contesting it, she made it clear, not in writing, not in anything documented, but clear in the way people make things clear when they've known you long enough to know exactly where to press, that if I pushed, things would come out, that Maya would find out, and she'd make sure of it. I can't explain what it is to feel the person who knows your whole life aim it at you. It is a specific and terrible kind of sick, and I made the decision I have never fully forgiven myself for. I let her have full custody, because the alternative was a courtroom version of the truth I had spent 13 years protecting my daughter from, and I could not do it. I told myself I'd still see Maya on weekends, that we'd work it out, that being a part-time father was better than being the man who detonated his daughter's sense of who she was. Then 2 months after the papers were signed, Diane sent me a text. I still have it. I've read it more times than I should have. It said, "She doesn't want to see you. She says she feels like you were never really her dad anyway. It's better if you give her some space, maybe permanent space." I read that sitting in my truck in the parking lot of a Lowe's. I had just bought outlet covers for a job the next morning. I put the phone down on the seat and I put both hands on the steering wheel and I sat there for a long time without moving. I didn't cry right away. It was worse than crying. It was the feeling of something structural giving way quietly, the way a wall sounds when something inside it finally goes. She feels like I was never really her dad. I believed it. I want to own that completely. I was broken at the time, and broken people reach for the explanation that hurts most because at some level they feel like they deserve it. The explanation fit everything: the calls that went to voicemail, the texts that got one-word answers and then no answers, the birthday where I left a voicemail she never returned. I told myself I was respecting her wishes. I told myself disappearing was the most decent thing I could do. So for 3 years I did exactly what Diane had told me to do. There was one day, 14 months into the silence, when I drove past Maya's high school and saw her in the parking lot after soccer practice. She was taller, her hair was different, she was laughing at something a teammate said, and for just a moment I thought she looked toward my truck. I didn't stop. I told myself she hadn't seen me, that she wouldn't want me to. I know now what she was actually thinking in those years, but I didn't know it then. Then it was just 3 years of February birthdays where I'd sit in my shop and think about a little girl asking for blueberries in her pancakes, now somewhere across town at 16, believing her father hadn't cared enough to stay. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. I didn't recognize the number. I almost let it go to voicemail. It was Carol, Diane's younger sister, the only person in that family who had kept my number and never pretended to forget it. Her voice was flat in the way voices go flat when a person is holding themselves very carefully together. She said, "Travis, I'm sorry to call, I didn't know if I should, but you need to know about Maya." Maya had been in a car accident 6 weeks earlier. A driver ran a red light on Route 40 and hit the passenger side doing 45 miles an hour. She'd survived, but one kidney had been destroyed and the other had been severely damaged. The functioning one was doing about 40% of what it should, and the long-term picture wasn't good. They'd been working to get her stable enough to evaluate for transplant. Living donor was strongly preferred if they could find a close match. They'd tested Diane not close enough. They'd reached out to Maya's biological father. Carol said this carefully and I listened carefully, and neither of us made it more than it needed to be. Scott in Phoenix had a health condition of his own that made donation impossible. And then Carol said, "Diane told them you weren't relevant, that it wouldn't work anyway. But Travis, you raised that girl. You should at least have the chance to try." I was already reaching for my jacket. I didn't stop to think through the medical logic because the medical logic was beside the point. My daughter needed a kidney. I had two. That was the entire equation as far as I was concerned. I didn't pause on the fact that I already knew I wouldn't be a match, that I couldn't be, not biologically, and that when they ran my HLA typing, trained medical eyes would see it immediately and unmistakably. I knew that by walking through those hospital doors, I was handing a room full of doctors the one thing I had sacrificed my family to protect. I did it without slowing down, because 16 years of being Maya's father had taught me one thing that settled the question before I'd even finished thinking it. There is no secret, no protection, no version of yourself that a real father won't set on fire to have a chance at saving his child. The secret didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except Maya. When I got to Grant Medical Center, Marissa was in the hallway. She saw me coming from 30 feet away, and her face did the thing a person's face does when the worst thing they needed to prevent has just walked in wearing work boots. She came toward me fast and quiet and said, "What are you doing here? You can't. You won't be a match. You know that. You know you can't do this, Travis." And she stopped herself because the end of that sentence was the thing we never said out loud in public, and we were standing in a hospital corridor. I looked at the woman who had taken my daughter and built a wall between us out of nothing but words, and I felt nothing I expected to feel, no rage, no satisfaction. I felt tired and very clear. I said, "Maya needs a donor. I'm going to get tested, whatever it shows." Something moved across Diane's face, something that might have been shame, real shame, maybe the first I'd ever seen from her, because I think she understood in that moment the exact difference between us. She had spent 3 years protecting a lie to hold on to the life she wanted. I was about to blow up that same lie without hesitating, on the slim chance it might save the daughter we both loved. One of us was willing to burn everything for Maya. It wasn't her. She didn't stop me. I went to the desk and said I was there to be evaluated as a living donor for Maya Holloway, that I was her father. They brought me back. The doctor who came to speak with me was Dr. Anita Okafor, the transplant nephrologist. She was calm and extremely careful in the way doctors are careful when they're carrying a result that could land in several different directions depending on the person sitting across from them. She asked if she could speak with me privately. I said yes. She sat down across from me in a small consultation room and folded her hands and said, "Mr. Travis, your tissue typing results show that you are not a biological match for Maya. I need to be precise about what that means medically. It's not simply that the compatibility isn't close enough. The panel shows no shared biological markers that we would expect between a parent and a child. A biological parent always contributes half of these markers. You share none of them. I ran the panel twice before calling you in. The result is the same both times." She paused. She was watching my face with a compassion so practiced and so careful it nearly broke me. She was braced for a man's world to come apart in front of her. I already knew what she had found. I had known it was coming since I backed out of my driveway that morning, so I didn't let her finish. I saved her from having to. I said, "She's not my biological daughter. That's what the test shows." Dr. Okafor blinked. That is not the sentence she had been expecting. Not in that tone, not with that face. She said very carefully, "Yes, that's correct. I'm so sorry. I know this must be." I stopped her, not unkindly. And I said 5 words, 5 quiet words I had carried for 16 years without ever having a reason to say them out loud. I said, "She has always been mine." And I watched her face change. It changed the way a face changes when someone realizes they've been looking at something upside down and suddenly it's right side up. The prepared compassion, the bracing for collapse, became something else entirely. Something I can only call a kind of awe, slow and recalibrating, as she understood what she was actually sitting across from. Not a man who had just discovered a betrayal, a man who had known from the very beginning, who had chosen a baby that wasn't his, been her father for 16 years with full knowledge, and then walked into this hospital and offered a kidney knowing what the test would reveal, because the chance to help her was worth more than any secret. She was quiet for a long moment, then she said very softly, "She is very lucky to have you." 3 years. That was the first time anyone had said anything like that to me in 3 years. I had to look at the wall for a second. The medical conversations that followed were careful and clinical, and they were the most honest conversations anyone in our family had ever had, because they were conducted by people who needed facts to save a child's life and had no patience for anyone's version of events. Diane had to sit in a room while a transplant coordinator laid out, plainly, that Maya's listed father had come voluntarily to donate, that his typing had shown he was not her biological parent, that the biological father had been contacted and was medically unable to help, and that they needed to understand the full family history to pursue every available avenue. The truth laid out like that by a stranger with a clipboard doesn't resemble the story Diane had been telling. It doesn't resemble what she'd told Maya over 3 years of careful misdirection. Because the man in those facts, the one who had knowingly married a pregnant woman and raised her daughter for 16 years and shown up to give a kidney knowing what it would cost him, is not a man you describe to your daughter as someone who was never really her dad anyway. Carol told Maya everything. She decided her niece was old enough at 16 to hear the truth from someone who loved her and had nothing to protect. She told her I had known from the beginning, that I had chosen her before she was born, that I had been pushed out with a lie and gone quietly to keep Maya from being caught in the middle of something ugly, that I had still come running the moment she got hurt, that I had still walked in to volunteer a kidney, knowing what the test would show, because any chance to help her was worth more to me than anything I was protecting. I've thought a great deal about what it is to be 16 and sick and have that handed to you, to have 3 years of believing your father had walked away replaced in one conversation with something that looks completely different. A man who hadn't walked away. A man who had been told to go and had gone and had spent every day since carrying her. They let me see her 2 days later. I stood in the doorway of her hospital room and I was more afraid than I had been at any point in this entire ordeal. The last real information I had about my daughter was that she felt like I was never really her father. I didn't know what I would see on her face. Maya looked up from the bed. She had an IV line in her arm and she looked the specific kind of tired that hospital rooms create. Not peaceful, just depleted, and she looked at me standing there and her chin started to shake and she said, "Dad?" Not a statement, a question. The most careful, fragile question, the kind a person asks when the answer being yes matters more than anything else in the world. I crossed that room. I sat on the edge of her bed and put my arm around her carefully, around all the lines and monitors, and she turned into my shoulder and cried, and I held her and I cried too, and neither of us said much for a while because the things that needed saying were already being said by the fact of us in the same room. 3 years gone in about 30 seconds, because love that real doesn't disappear, it just waits. She told me later, when she was more herself, what those 3 years had actually looked like from where she was standing, that she'd been told I stopped calling because I'd moved on, that her mother had said, gently and repeatedly, that sometimes men who weren't the biological father eventually pulled away, that it wasn't really my fault, just how some men were built. That Maya had spent 3 years constructing a version of me out of those explanations, a version she didn't want to believe but couldn't argue with because she was 13 and then 14 and then 15, and the man in the story had simply stopped showing up. She told me she had almost texted me 100 times, that she'd typed my name into her phone and deleted it because she was afraid I wouldn't respond, because she had been told I wouldn't want to. 2 lies aimed in opposite directions with a girl in the middle of the silence they made. Diane came to find me once near the end of Maya's recovery. She sat down across from me in the hospital cafeteria, and she looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and was finally trying to figure out where to set it down. She said she was sorry. She said she had told herself for 3 years that she was giving Maya a cleaner situation, a fresh start without the complication of an ex-husband who wasn't even the biological father. She said watching me walk in to offer a kidney, she knew I couldn't give had shown her something about herself she hadn't been able to look away from since. I listened. I didn't say much. There wasn't anything to say that the facts hadn't already said more plainly than I ever could. I told her the only thing I actually cared about was being Maya's father going forward, that I wasn't interested in a war, that our daughter needed both of her parents working. She nodded. She cried a little. She went back down the hall. I don't hate her. I've made sure of that because hating her would cost me things I've just gotten back. She did real damage and I won't pretend otherwise. But she is Maya's mother and Maya loves her, and I am not going to spend the back half of my life teaching my daughter to resent the woman who raised her. I watched what being caught between 2 people's versions of each other did to a kid. I am not going to build new versions of that just aimed in a different direction. When Maya is with me, I don't run Diane down. I let her work out her own feelings in her own time, because that's her journey and not mine to poison, It's always been about Maya. Everything I've done as her father has been for her. Maya didn't get my kidney. I knew she wouldn't when I left my driveway that morning. What saved her was a woman in Michigan, 44 years old, registered on the National Kidney Registry 8 years ago and nearly forgotten she'd done it. When the transplant coordinator called, she said yes immediately, a total stranger who owed Maya nothing, who gave something of herself to save a girl she will never meet. I have thought about that a great deal. My daughter was saved by a stranger's generosity and raised by a man she wasn't biologically related to. Twice over, the thing that saved her had nothing to do with blood, everything to do with somebody deciding to show up. That is the whole meaning of everything I've told you. The bonds that actually hold us together, the ones that catch us when the rest of it is falling, are almost never about biology. They're about who decides to stay, who makes the choice every single morning and means it. Maya is doing well now. The transplant held. She finished her junior year from home and went back in the fall. We have dinner together most Sundays. She drives over herself, the girl who got her license 3 months after her doctors cleared her, who called me the night before her road test to be nervous out loud for 40 minutes while I sat in my kitchen trying not to let her hear how much I had missed the sound of her voice. Last month she sent me a text with a screenshot. It was her college application essay. She asked if I'd read it and tell her what I thought. The essay was about a man who chose to be her father knowing full well he didn't have to, about what it means to be chosen, about how she used to think the most important kind of love was the automatic kind, the biological kind, the kind you're born into whether you asked for it or not, and how she knows now that the most important kind is the kind someone picks up deliberately, every day, and carries even when it costs them everything. She asked me if she should soften it, make it less personal. I told her no. I told her to leave it exactly as it was. Some truths don't need softening. Some truths were just waiting for the right moment and the right room and someone with nothing left to protect finally saying them out loud. If you've stayed with me all the way to here, I want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life you've been holding at arm's length because the truth between you feels too tangled to touch? Someone who doesn't know the full story of how much you've been carrying them? I'm not saying the timing is always right. I'm not saying truth doesn't cost anything. I'm saying I spent 3 years and a kidney evaluation to get back Sunday dinners and a nervous phone call the night before a road test, and I would do every single bit of it again without hesitating for 1 second. Leave a comment if something in this landed for you, even a single word. I read every one. And then please, go look up the National Kidney Registry or the Bone Marrow Registry. It takes almost nothing to sign up. Somewhere out there, a kid who looks a lot like someone's daughter is running out of time, waiting on a stranger who hasn't decided yet. My daughter is alive because one stranger decided. Maybe the next one is you.